Okay, my name's Maya Underwood from the School of Social Science, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce you Professor Paul Hendon, also from the School of Social Science. Paul is a pioneer in the digital space at UQ. He leads the Digital Societies cluster within our school and is part of the Digital Cultures and Societies Research Hub. He is the Chief Investigator and UQ Node Leader for the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. And he's just a generally top bloke. He's an awesome academic, one that I aim to be like, generous with his time and very open to new ideas. So it's my pleasure to introduce him to talk about digital network social science approaches, concepts and methods.
Thanks, Maya.
No worries, Paul. It's a bit echoey. I don't know if it's because of the two computers.
I don't know if you want, you can see on the video. You can let me know what's happening on the video. So thank you everyone for joining us, both in person and online. And I'm recording this for so that it can be available for people who couldn't attend. And I know there's a few people who've indicated that. So today I wanted to just introduce to the idea of thinking about networks as a way in which to do research in social sciences and humanities. And I'm trying to do a couple of things. I'm trying to think about conceptually what does it mean to think about the world in terms of networks, and also how do we then think about approaches, methodological approaches to networks, and then I'll explore the ways in which some of the underpinnings, the mathematical underpinnings. I won't give you any formulas or anything, but to highlight how it's the kind of key concepts in the methodology, and introduce you to some of the, particularly the visualization tools, which are actually quite easy to use. But before we get started, I want to first acknowledge the traditional owners on which the UQ stands, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and acknowledging their unceded land and their leaders, past, present, and emerging. Start by. So what I was trying to say before is in the visualization, and it should be working. It should okay work now without the losing of the sound. Is we see the growth of a cluster of COVID cases occurring in New South Wales and how the connections occur and create different clusters. Now, the person who did this, Mike Hunning, refers to a comment from the New South Wales public health person. Where is her name? I can't remember there. But what has happened, what you can see here is that the growth of COVID cases is occurring across a network, and we hear a lot of discussions about the COVID cases is about the clustering of patterns. And so it's not just people's connections to each other, but it's also the nature of clusters that occur. So we have super spreader events, we have workplaces, and we can see sub-networks that are occurring within in society that creates different dynamics in relation to COVID. And so while we had a one-size-fits-all approach where we shut down everything initially, we then learned that there are different places in which COVID was likely to break out, and that was related to the network dynamic that was occurring in different places. Here we go. So what Daniel Reid has said is, okay, Kerry Chant just broke something really crucial, the network epidemiology of workplace-driven outbreaks. So workplaces are melting pots that connect multiple smaller households and family networks. And so what he calls this is the classic small world network dynamics. Now, the idea of the classic small world network dynamics comes from social psychology and sociology back in 1967. And you might have heard the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon, or the 7 degrees of separation. This is fundamentally what it's about. So the idea that we can connect to a whole group of people the large-scale population just through a few steps. And Daniel Readers goes on to say that economists repeatedly make a mistake in thinking that the ref is uniform across populations. They see the population as a disorganized complexity. And it then goes to say applied epidemiologists and social scientists understand that the population has a structure, a network of networks. It is an organized complexity. And with this in mind, the implicit purpose of restrictions is not to ensure that every member of the population stays home so that no one can possibly be infected. Crucial is to understand that the goal is often to reduce the mixing rate amongst people of different networks. And so you can see then he goes on to say that the way in which COVID gets into a specific sub-network generates a spike in numbers because it's the nature of the lumpy nature of networks in society. And so I think what the key thing is that COVID is teaching us in really profound ways is that we actually need to think about the relationships that we have in our social in society, rather than think of it as one kind of connectedness that we all make up.
Paul, I hate to interrupt you again, but the technology is against you. Now there's no signal to the camera.
The what?
The camera has no signal.
But they can see the video Zoom, right?
Yeah, they can see.
Well, let's just turn
the screen.
Let's just turn the camera off, right? I don't know. I can do the webcam. But there we go. But that's just seeing my chest, right?
Yes, that's right.
There's no point in seeing my chest.
Okay. Nice shirt.
So what I want to do with that starting point is really just to kind of highlight, well, why should we start thinking about networks? And I come from a social science and sociology perspective, and I think this is why I'm making the case that we actually should think about networks. So the overview today is, first of all, thinking about networks and the way in which social scientists approach our understanding of the world, our ontologies. I then want to go into the social networks as a research methodology, and I want to give some examples of how of different types of research that make use of network analysis. And then I want to introduce you to visualizing and analyzing social networks, introducing in particular the two visualization tools, Node, Excel, and Gephi. So let's think about networks and social ontology. So how do we think about society? And too often we have an entity way of thinking about, what I call an entity way of thinking about society. We think of the world as made up of things. And typically in social sciences and sociology, those things are largely humans. We don't think about other things outside of humans. And we give characteristics to these entities, to people. They have an age, a gender, potentially a family type, and a profession. And what we want to see is that analyze these characteristics to see the differences between characteristics in society. So, for example, we might see the relationship between gender and income, and try to see some aggregate level understanding of society. It's going on to that automatic thing again. I have no idea what's going on. And so power then is something that resides in individuals or a collective, which is like institutions. And so things like people of colour have less money. That's again, the kind of the ways in which we relate individuals and characteristics to see what the patterns are. Now, what I want to say is that kind of a way, it misses the important relational aspects of thinking about society. So for me, it's like we actually have to understand the world as more than just entities. Entities exist in relation to each other. And what that relationship is what really matters as much as that entity. So in fact, you might argue that the entity is defined by its relationships. So for example, the idea of a mother, an employee, a king, are all of it defined by their relationship to other entities. They're not in itself defined by in and of itself. It's designed by a relationship. And in fact, we might even go into the question about thinking about humans, individual humans. I don't know what's going on.
Must be giving off electromagnetic fields.
I'm going
or
to,
something to that
sorry, I'm going to turn, click.
If you go to the PowerPoint presentation part, you may find something to play automatically every, for example, 30 seconds. Maybe it is ticked in there.
Slideshow.
Yep.
There we go. Take off the timing.
Yep.
There we go. I don't know how it kind of got clicked. And so we might even begin to question about the idea of the individual as a single self-contained entity. So feminists' critiques of individual selves highlight the way in which modernity is focusing on citizens as individuals and have their own autonomy, etc. But the feminist critique is always that there's relations of dependency and interdependency. That the kind of the ideal man, that's kind of the Robinson Crusoes, we don't exist like that. And we're also defined by our relationships to what we wear, how we position ourselves within our clothes, our products. But we even, if you go into microbial analysis, we can see that the idea of a human is fundamentally interconnected even with microbes. The microbes through our skin, through our gut, they actually make us who we are. We can't operate with those type of things, those elements. So even the concept of entities in itself as a unified thing is problematic. Now, how do people have thought about these ideas about networks? And obviously, CASTELLS is one of the key thinkers and fairly obvious ones in this world, particularly when we're thinking about the digital world. Manuel CASTELLS obviously introduced the concept of a network society, and clearly as part of that is he's arguing that network is an ontology, a way of thinking about society, and he's trying to contrast that in relation to the ideas of hierarchy and stratification. So he says network society is a society where key social structures and activities are organised around electronic processed information networks. So here we see very much he's arguing that the electronic networks is actually reconstructing the nature of society. And he sees that networks are existing in a range of ways of operating in society, from the state to businesses to production process to community organisations. And he even goes as far as to argue that networks are the basic units of modern society. And fundamentally that these networks are more flat and then hierarchical. And he argues that you can see in the mode of productions that are moved to far more network modes of connection and processes rather than hierarchical ways of processing. And importantly, in a network, he also points to the fact that their network through digital technology is a flow, it has a processual element, a space of flows. And that space of flows becomes detached from geography and physical space. And he also refers to the idea of timeless time, that the digital technology operates in a sense of instantaneity. So that's one approach to thinking about network society, about networks and society. The second most obvious one is Bruno Latour's and Michel Callion and John Law's work on actor network theory. And a key thing about actor network theory is that it basically argues that an actor gets its ability to act because it's part of a network. And more than that, the actors are networks. So not only are actors networks, but the networks are where the agency, the capacity to act. So the focus is not so much on the individuals, but the individuals in relationship. And again, this is a very much an ontological approach. And an example of that is Latour's argument about the gun debate in the US. So when you've got statements like guns don't kill people, people kill people. And he says that that basically is an entity way of thinking about the world. It misses the point that when we consider a human as an entity and a gun as an entity, when they come together, they'll become a new entity, what he calls a human gun. And that combined entity, or that different entity, is quite different to the two entities that don't have a relationship. So again, the connections that are there are really important. Now, Latour and others have actually had called this actor network, the sociology of associations, the sociology of relationships. And in France, there has been a recent reappraisal of Gabriel Tard's work. Gabriel Tard was a sociologist writing in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And he was actually a generation above Durkheim. But he was in debate with Durkheim, and then eventually Durkheim's approach to sociology became dominant, and Tard's work was seen as silly and ambiguous. Now, Latour and others are now arguing that Tard's work on what monadology is that everything is a society and all things are a society. So thereby what science it is when we think about human society, is not just a collective of things, but a collective of things in relationship to each other. And so in his work, Monadology and Sociology, published in 1893, he says so-called individual bodies are a multiplicity of distinct elements linked to each other in the same way as they are linked to the elements of other aggregates. And so you can see this idea here is that this collectivity is very much a collectivity of relationships. And again, monads and their elements belong to, possess each other. And again, it goes back to the idea that we are in relationships, and the way in which we are in the individual and an entity is impacts on what the other entity is. That we are co-constituted. And this is fundamentally not only relational, but is in emotion. It is about flows. And this is where Deleuze actually takes draws upon Tard's work implicitly. Now, going back further, now I started with more recent sociology and social thinking, and going back, but I really want to go back to something that's more challenging for us, is our Indigenous ontologies. And when we're thinking about the way in which Indigenous knowledge engages with the Western knowledge, one of the things that we need to learn is that fundamentally to Indigenous ways of thinking is relationality. And Aileen Morton Robinson makes the point that Indigenous ways of apprehending ourselves in our world is thoroughly relational. Aileen Morton Robinson, a professor at UQ and located in the School of Social Science, writes, relationality is grounded in a holistic conception of the interconnectedness and intersubstantiation between and among all living things in the earth, which is inhabited by a world of ancestors and creator beings. And this idea of relationality is connected to the idea of country, big C country. And this is why the land is so important to Indigenous peoples. So Lauren Tynan says, as a foundation, relationality is how the world is known and how we as peoples, country, entities, stories, and more than human kin know ourselves and our responsibilities to one another. A relational reality creates relationships between ideas or entities. It is an effective force that compels us to not just understand the world as relational, but feel the world as kin. Relationality is premised on a truth that all things exist in relatedness. So you can see very much in this Indigenous way of thinking, it is a challenge to us when we only have created societies as individuals that are aggregated. And so this relational way of thinking inverts what is the principal thing, rather than saying entities are the primary concept, but the relations are. And again, another Indigenous writer, this one's a Canadian Indigenous writer, says relationships do not merely shape reality, they are reality. And so for me, these are really challenging ways of thinking and challenging how we've thought about society. It also speaks to the nature of how we think about agency. Now, you would never see a children's book, Hollywood actors, A-list actors in the form of VC in one slide. Here we go. So I don't know who anyone's seen knows the story who sank the boat. I love Who Sank the Boat. It was a really challenging one because basically the boat sinks because a mouse gets on it, but other people have gotten on. There's a challenge to think about, well, who actually sank the boat? And it is a sense that this is rather than moving from the individual having agency, that it's the collective activity that leads to the boat sinking. Now, this idea of the individual agency is imbued throughout our society. I have to say academics do it all the time. I often hear people who have been on a co-authored article say my paper rather than our paper. Why have I put the Hollywood actors up there? We see, like, I idealise our Hollywood, both The Rock and Scarlett Johansson are the top paid male and female actors in Hollywood at the moment. And it really surprises me. And they go, oh, well, he's worth $25 million a movie. I go, well, what does it mean he's worth? Like, so to think that he's got draw card for $25 million, but the only way he can get that 25 million is he's part of a network. He's part of a network of producers, of writers, of cinematographers, etc. But he is able to claim his priority within that network somehow. Now we could say, oh yeah, but that's why people go to watch it and everything like that. Let's think about another more absurd concept, well, potentially more absurd. When our previous VC retired from UQ, there was a statement that said, during his time, he graduated 8,000 or something like that students. Now, I just thought, I scratched myself, like he didn't teach one student at university. How could he possibly have graduated 8,000? But again, let's go to this idea that we are giving agency to individuals within a network and saying they have the nature, they have the thing. So we're doing a lot of intellectual things that are highly problematic in thinking through the ways in which agency and individuals in relation are operating. So that's kind of the conceptual ways of thinking about how do we think about networks in thinking about society. So I now want to move into thinking about social network analysis as a methodology of networks. So social network analysis is actually not a new approach to social research. It has a long-standing tradition. The problem, and particularly most often used in understanding social network analysis, network dynamics or relational dynamics within organisations. But the problem has been is that it is a difficult methodology to collect data. It basically requires going, Maya, can you tell me who you have interactions with on a daily basis? And then go to everybody else and go to who are each of you, and to see who has connections with each other and trying to build it up from that. So there's a big challenge in collecting the data, but there's also big challenges in analysing that because there are complex mathematics to deal with that when you've got a network of 100 people or even 60 people. But the growth of digital technology, where we can both now collect data through our social networks, through the digital traces we have, but also the computational power has created a new way of thinking about and researching networks. So network research is based on mathematical graph theory. So that's the mathematics to analysing networks. And fundamentally, that graph theory is based on the idea of nodes, or these what we might call entities. These are also vertices. These are the dots in a network relationship. And what connects them is edges, or what we might say the relationship. And these can be, so the nodes can be individuals, they could be social media posts, and the relationships can be connections between people, or connections between posts, or connections between, so for example, if you were analysing hashtags, you could be looking at how hashtags are used together. And so whether they're used in combination on the same post, then they've got that connection. These entities can be directed or undirected. So think about Facebook, for example. When I accept a Facebook request, that relationship between me and my Facebook friend is two-way. They follow me and I follow them. If you go on Twitter, the relationship is a one-way thing. You actually just follow one person. You don't get the connection. There may be sometimes they follow you and you follow them, but the connection has to be created in that sense. So we can analyze, think about networks as undirected. That means all of the relationships are reciprocal, or they are, that is decides, or that can be directed in a sense that means something else, connected to something else. So what can be networks? So obviously people can be networks and their relationships. So here on the visualization here on the right is a visualization that's been prepared by Timothy Graham, and in his article with Naomi Smith, called Mapping the Anti-Vaccine Movement on Facebook. And so what they've done is actually look at people who have both responded on, wait a second, I think what they did is they actually looked at whether people were responding to the same post and their connectedness like that. So you can see in the network, the purple is female, male is yellow. So you can see that the network of the anti-vaccinations is largely made up of women, but there are big spikes around here, like here, that are men that have got a lot of connections with each other. So men in the network do have when they're there, often play a big significant role in the network. So those relationships in social media can be connection. Citation networks is like a one directional thing. So we can think about citing a publication and someone who cites us. So Library Word Science has done that for a long period of time, using citation networks. I've got a student, Joyce Sheck, who's actually looking at citations in legal judgments, and did a bit of a network analysis of that. As I mentioned, we can do networks of hashtags in Twitter and Facebook posts. We can also generate, if we're looking at textual analysis using what we call topic modeling, we can actually see the relationship between different topics, or even if we think about it in a more simpler way, concept mapping. And we can also look at hyperlink networks, so the way in which relationships between website to website or web page to website, how are they connected? And we can also introduce the dynamic element and a geospatial element into all of those. So for example, this is work by Mark Owen Jones. He's published on Twitter recently, the Twitter accounts actually, let's move this down. So he's looking at the hashtags I stand with Putin and I stand with Russia in early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And he's done over 20,000 tweets with almost 10,000 Twitter accounts. And he discovered that when he did the analysis, that there was one cluster of groups that are pro, so that is saying they're standing with Putin, they're standing with Russia. There's a group here that is anti, that is against that, and there's a group of here that are largely bots, automated accounts that respond. I think I've got a breakdown of that, have I? So what he says is that the different colours are different communities. So these are, when we talk about communities, they're kind of sub-networks that are interconnected more tightly together to each other. So you can see here we've got the brews, so that they're largely seen to be interconnected. But here we've got some subgroup networks coming through over there. So they're, in a sense, they're sub-communities. And you can see that they're interacting each other, and you can see quite clearly that there's quite a lot of interaction happening here, but also interaction happening here, and some minor interaction happening coming through there. So the bot type cluster seem to be accounts offering products, laptops, and so they're jumping off the hashtag to sell their wares. So they're basically going, hey, I'm using this hashtag. Not to actually because I agree with it or anything, but because if I put it up there, people who are following the hashtag will see my account and go, and they're using it for a form of advertising. So they're using their tweets to boost their hashtag, but they at the same time not only boost themselves, but to boost their hashtag as well. The cluster 2 is the anti accounts, and are very active and very large. These are people condemning the hashtag. This is well-meaning, of course, but boosts the sentiment. So this is what a lot of disinformation research is saying. If you're actually reposting disinformation, you're actually adding to it, to this dynamic. And so what you would see is they generally take a screenshot and cover it like that. So it actually doesn't add to the Twitter account, or like trending accounts. And cluster 1 is the people that are seemingly supporting Putin, Russia, and the war. A lot of that is also connected. When you look at the accounts, they seem to be puppet accounts. That's these ones that have actually created in a very short time period. They are bots, etc. And most of them based in Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, India, and the US. And they often use the same tropes. And so what you can do here in this analysis is not only just look at the network as visually, but you can drill down to see, well, these, you can see who are at the center of those. And you can see, well, these ones here, and go, these ones that seem to be crucial to the network, who are they? What are they doing? And it gives you analysis about the dynamics of what is happening. So the network analysis is not just looking at the network as a whole, but provides a window into thinking through different elements of that network. And that's one of the powerful things. It's not just networks in itself, but it can be combined with other forms of research to understand something about the social dynamics. This is an example of a hyperlink network. And so that I did research with colleagues, Rob Ackley and Tim Graham. And what we did was we started with 75 UK government websites, and we scanned their connections outwards to other websites, and also what websites were linking into these government websites. And we discovered over 19,000 websites, and with 135,000 connections. And so you can see here that visualization. I don't want to go into any more detail, but the size of those dots represent the levels of interactions that they have with each other. And you can visualize it in terms of different things. I've done something similar also with research with colleagues at Griffith University and University of New South Wales, looking at the Queensland National Disability Insurance Scheme. So one of the key things about the National Disability Insurance Scheme is that it is a marketised version of disability services. And so in a market, but also has a level of collaboration occurring in it. So for example, people with disability that might have multiple care needs, so like daily support, housing, health needs, etc., often will have to coordinate that care. So how do we coordinate that care? And traditionally, a lot of disability service organisations coordinated care with other organisations to provide that services for the individuals with the disability. And so we were interested in the way in which organisations in the National Disability Insurance Scheme actually related to themselves online. And so here we actually started with over 200 websites that were related to the National Disability Insurance Scheme and were registered to provide services. And what we found, interestingly, is all of these ones that are not connected to each other in that 217 websites, which suggests that they don't see themselves as part of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So they might be psychologists, physiotherapists, people providing mainstream services, but also to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And we see some key ones like the National Disability Insurance Agency and the Department of Social Services, the really big government agencies really strongly, but we also see Clickability, which is actually a brokerage site that is actually new. So when you're trying to navigate an online network or find out who's actually providing services of different things, you can do Google, but you can also go to Clickability, and it's like a brokerage service where you can, and it tells you who is providing those services. So it's become really, in a new way, an entrepreneurial organisation in this network. So again, we're using ways in which to think about this. And we also were doing interviews with organisations to see how they connected with each other, to try to see to what extent was the online relationships match the offline relationships. Now, I mentioned before that, this hyperlink of the UK government. And I've also mentioned the way in which we can look at our sub-networks. This is an approach which we call community detection. And so if we've got this large network of websites, we're actually trying to make a sense of that. What you can do is a technique to actually trying to say, well, where are the websites that connect often to each other, and to try to break it down. So here we had 15,000 websites. We did something similar for the Australian government websites. So this is both at local, federal and state level websites. And then we said what ones were actually interconnected a lot to each other. And so we found that in this case, a node is a subnetwork. So we call that Queensland government. It's largely made up of websites of the Queensland government and websites that provide services in relation to Queensland. And you can see that that is separate. This is a sub-network or a cluster of websites that relate to health. And so they interconnect to each other. So you can start to think about, actually, that starts to make sense, that there are actually a pattern of connections that are occurring. And we can think about that in society, like family units or extended family units connecting with other family units. And so then you can see the relationship between these different subnetworks. So that's another way in which we can understand and draw information from networks. And my final example is a work from Angus Veitch, who's a former PhD student of mine, and Dan Angus. And his PhD thesis was Accounting for Context in the Use of Topic Models in Social Science, a case study exploring public discourse on coal seam gas in Australia. Now, what he did was actually look at over 15,000 texts that were related to coal seam gas mining through the news, but also advocacy websites and other government websites. And he analysed to see, well, what type of topics did they talk about when they talked about coal seam gas. So whether they talked about mergers between coal seam gas companies, whether they talked about environmental impact, whether they talked about protest, etc. And what he found is when they looked at the types of publications that published similar types of things, this was the relationships that he had. So in a sense, these are the outlets. And you see like the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, the Courier Mail, very in this kind of grouping that are orange. We see here in blue, the ABC News, and here we've got some dark green, we've got smaller ones, the Chronicle, etc. Now, the ones that are connected tend to have similar types of coverage in their media. So what you found, oh, I can't do that because I've got to do that. So when he looked at this one, the Australian, the Financial Review, the Courier Mail, the Sydney Morning Herald, they tended to focus far more on economic things like offer, bid, takeover, directors, hostile. So that's what we call a topic, a list of terms that are connected to each other. I don't want to talk about topic modelling and textual computational textual analysis, but that's what he did. But he could see that the connections that are occurring. The second one, pipeline, petajoules, coal seam, methane, contract. Next one, takeover, bid, merger. So you can see here there's production and economics focus on those ones. When we go to the next one, the ABC News, Australian Associated Press, Lock the Gate, the Newcastle, it's to talk about politics. So lock the gate, a moratorium, police protesters, bill trigger powers, draft submission, etc. So political engagement with that. So you can see that there's a lot of power in using data social networks analysis. The last section I want to do is focusing on visualizing and analyzing networks. And the key thing is the tools of how to do it. So it's actually relatively easy. Once you've got network data, it's relatively easy actually to do visualization. Three key ones is Gephi, Node Excel, which is actually a plugin for Excel, Microsoft Excel, and Cytoscape, and actually has been developed for chemical and molecular visualizations, but I've not used it myself. So let's think, this is a work that I used early on to try to visualize relationships and disability support. And this was done through using Node Excel. So we talked about what we identify in different models for support. And so this is an example, one of the models that we called, which was called the uncoordinated model of disability support governance. So we have in the middle, the individual received with the disability, and they're receiving support that's uncoordinated from residential, domestic help, personal care, income, aids and equipment, accommodation. So you can see that that's coming into individuals. Now, how do we go about visualizing this? So there's actually quite simple. A network is basically made up of two lots of information. One is the entities, so each of these, the nodes. So you list all them. And the second thing is the relationships, the edges. So how do we do that? So this is just what we had over there. Here we've got the vertex. The nodes are called individual, family, accommodation, personal care, domestic health, respite, aids and equipment, income. And with Node Excel, I can indicate different characteristics of those things, and that then basically helps to create this image without the ID, without the connections. So it's basically you list all of the edges, each list all the entities, all the nodes, and then you list the connections. So care goes to individual. So you see where it's care, personal care to individual. It's a directed graph in that case. Help to individual, respite to individual, income to individual. And that's all it is. That's fundamentally all it is to create that. And you can, these things are basically different levels of characteristics. So you can say, okay, how heavy is the edge? Is that a stronger connection? So for example, if we're thinking about social relationships, you might say, well, I've got a really strong relationship with them, or I see them many times in a week or etc. So you can weight those things based on what's important to it. The other element, and I'll just come to using those tools shortly, another element is understanding and analysing the network. So I mentioned that network analysis is based on mathematical graph theory. But when we're looking at it, we're actually looking at a network. There are ways in which to think about the network. So I've already mentioned about segmentation is what are the cliques or the clusters or communities that are occurring within the network? And there are different techniques for working out what those are. So you can see here, these are just small ones, but you can see here, there's a cluster here that's probably that one doesn't belong to. And we saw previously the clusterings in the images, in the colorings of them. That's one way we can analyze it. Another way is to think about, well, what are the kind of dimensions and distributions in that? Or what role individual nodes play within that network. So a bridge is a place that kind of connects to the rest of the network. See this one here connects largely to that one. Here it connects to everyone else. So it plays an important role as a connector. So you can think of the individual within in groups or social networks that's really able to go, oh yeah, you should meet that person. So they have a different role in social relations than other people. We can also think about the density of networks. So how well everybody knows each other or is connected to each other. So in this one here, this is fully connected. It's highly dense because everything is connected to each other. Whereas something like that, it's got low connectivity and this one, because there's only a few levels of edges within it. So we can analyze the density. We can also do the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon just to see how any one node in each of them, you can get to another node. So for here, you've got to go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to get to there. Here, you only ever need to go to 1. And that's partly related to density. So that distance tells you how far it is to get to. Tie strength is again about the connected, like if I said that the relationship, it has a stronger relationship or a weaker relationship, that relates to that. Centrality is about who are the important nodes. And so when Google created its search engine, it originally used an algorithm called PageRank. And PageRank was basically a calculation to say, who is the most important, or what is the most important website in this network? And so, but what does it mean by not most important? So in here, you can see that's probably the most important because other ones will point to it. Now there is a for directed nodes, directed edges, there are 2 ways of thinking about the most important node within a network. One is that the ones that are what we call authority. So that's the ones that everyone goes to going, oh yeah, go to that person, go to Maya, she knows everything about everything, right? That's the authority. The other one, which is like I talked about clickability, is the hub. Oh, they can point you to the right person to go. So in the sense they become important because they connect to everyone. Whereas the other ones are more authority, you go to that for source. The other ones go to connect you outwards. So we can think about the ways in which to analyze networks like that. We can also think about the connections, to what extent they are what extent that they're reciprocated, or get around right now. Right. Reciprocated, thank you, Maya. So that's obviously in a directed network, to what extent they're reciprocated, and that speaks to what kind of relationships you have with the people. Homophily is about to what extent do the nodes within that similar to each other. So for example, we could look at those Twitter accounts and say to what extent they all have similar attributes, etc. And this one here, propinquity, is just whether those ties are specifically close or spatially close. So if you have a network that's geographical, and to see to what extent are they close together. So there's lots of different mechanisms to analyze this. So I'm kind of finishing up very soon, but I wanted to show you in Gephi, which is similar to what we did with Node Excel. When you open up Gephi, you have it in the data laboratory. We basically have the same thing what I said before. We have the nodes. And so basically you can have just this list of nodes from N0 to N9. I've given, in this case, we've given different characteristics to it. So we've given a label. So what actually is this one? So that's usa.gov.au, and different web pages, etc. And then the second one is we click on edges, we find that edges NO connects to N1, NO connects to N2, NO connects to N7 in a directed graph. So that tells you that that basically does the same thing. The thing with Gephi is that this is the visualization of the of USA.gov, the website, which is the front, what we call the front door to government, USA government. It is a small website, relatively small website. The pink is the is web pages outside of that website. So all of these are separate web pages, and pink is those that are connected outside of USA.gov. The green ones are part of USA.gov. But what we can see here is that rather than we go to overview at the very top rather than data laboratory, we can start to do a whole range of things. So we can click on appearances and we can change those things. We can change the size of the nodes. We can change the coloring of nodes, depending on what attribute we want to give highlight into. So we can, for example, give highlight into whether it's a .commercial website or a .gov website or a .org website. We can give highlight on the basis of how many web pages it has, or how old that person is, or their height, for example. And then we also use a layout. So a layout is the way in which we visualize that structure. And there are different ways in which to, this often use Force Atlas. There are different algorithms to create that visualization about how does it position the nodes to each other and taking into account that relationship. And on the right-hand side, we've got statistics where we can actually run some of these things, like PageRank. The HITS algorithm is the authority, and Hubs one. Modularity creates modules, that is like small clusters, etc. So we can create, use some statistics. So we actually don't need to know the mathematics behind it, but it gives you a sense about, it calculates that, and then you can go, oh, well, this tells us something about that. So there's a lot you can actually do with Gephi fairly simply without actually having to do complex information about how to use technology.
Or is it possible to collect data based on the specific geolocation?
Sorry?
Is it possible to collect data for these waves, such as I want to go for like US.gov only for the New York,
Only
or the Texas,
For a specific
for a
geographic
specific geolocation?
Oh, sure.
Is it possible?
You can collect it.
I just want to know that how US.gov is connected just within the geolocation of Texas.
So you have to know, so for example, a lot of like you've got .com.au, which is commercial ones in Australia, and .com.jp would be the commercial ones in Japan.
Yes.
A lot of them are just .com, so you don't have a generic notification of where it belongs to. You can use their geolocation.
This information is for whole USA.
This is just for the.
I assume that.
So this is the USA.gov website. So it's a single website.
But when you go for data collection or the web scraping, then it will give data for the whole geolocation of maybe for the whole world.
So you need to depending on how you want to geolocate it. So you can use their what I call their country code. You can use that as a substitute for things like USA.gov and Facebook.com, there doesn't have a country code. So you can either say, oh, they're basically US because that's where a lot of your .coms are, or you can then go and test the website and find out where is it that their geolocation is. You can test that.
It can be found by the IP of the website.
Sorry?
I mean, it can be found by the IP of the website where it is
Yeah.
geolocated, so you can collect all of the data that is available on the websites.
Yeah. So lastly, I just want to cover briefly the way in which we may collect data, network data. And I don't want to go into detail because this is perhaps the hardest thing. But obviously I mentioned earlier on that we can use surveys to try to get people to talk about their connections. And so I've done this in class. I've got students to talk about who they connected to, who do they connected with in class to other people. VOSON is the VOSON Lab, which is the virtual observatory for the study of online networks based at the ANU, provides a fairly usable platform to collect data, both web scraping and also social media data. The APIs or application programming interfaces are provided by a number of platforms like Twitter and Reddit. Facebook used to have that, but they shut it down in the light of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So, or they have very limited capacity for researchers to use their application programming interface. You basically have to be an advertiser to use it. There are other tools like the issue crawler that comes out of the Digital Methods Initiative, which is from the Netherlands. And see, some of these provided a more simpler approach to creating data sets that relate to social media and online web, if you want to use those type of things. So just that's it. I've just got some slides to talking about getting started with network visualization and also further reading. So that's it for today, and thank you for coming. So